Snow-covered expanses, gray skies, and biting winds. Winter in medieval England was a harsh test. Without central heating, modern materials, or technology, survival depended on a well-thought-out strategy. And one of its key components was clothing. It not only protected against the cold, but also served as a multi-layered shield that allowed people to continue their normal lives even in the most severe frosts. We tend to think of medieval fashion as crude and uncomfortable, but in fact, it was incredibly practical and adapted to the realities of the time. In this video, we will immerse ourselves in the world of medieval fashion and learn how simple woolen fabrics, clever cuts, and unexpected solutions helped people survive the cold. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one small detail in clothing saved the lives of entire families. When we think of medieval clothing, wool immediately comes to mind, and rightly so, as it was the main material used. But its role was much more complex than simply keeping warm. Wool not only retained heat, but was also water repellent thanks to its lanolin content. This natural lubricant, which coats the fibers, prevented moisture from quickly penetrating the fabric, which was critical in conditions of frequent precipitation and slush. However, wool was not the only key material. Imagine trying to put on several layers of thick woolen clothing. It is uncomfortable and restricts movement. That is why clothing made from other, lighter materials, such as linen, was worn under woolen cloaks and tunics. Although linen was not as warm as wool, it had another important property. It wicked moisture away from the body. As a result, sweat did not accumulate on the skin and cool it down. The layering system looks something like this: a linen undershirt or tunic that absorbed moisture, and several layers of wool on top to retain heat. This multi-layered approach provided comfort and protection in all weather conditions. Interestingly, we use a similar system in modern outdoor clothing today. Creating such a wardrobe was a long and laborious process. Wool was obtained from sheep, which were bred everywhere. After shearing, it was cleaned, combed, and spun into yarn. This process often involved entire families, as almost every home had a spinning wheel. The yarn was then woven on hand looms. The denser the fabric, the better it protected against the cold and wind. The quality of the fabric depended directly on the skill of the weaver and the quality of the raw materials. After the fabric was created, it was subjected to fouling, a special process of compaction that made the material even more impervious and warm. Natural dyes were used to color the fabrics. The colors were mostly muted shades of brown, gray, blue, and red, which were obtained from roots, tree bark, and berries. Bright colors, such as purple, were very expensive and were used only by the nobility. Therefore, the clothes of ordinary people were usually plain and dark, which also had a practical advantage. Dirt and stains were less noticeable on them. The variety of clothing depended not only on the materials, but also on social status and occupation. Peasants wore simple, coarse tunics and trousers that could withstand hard physical labor. They were loose-fitting so as not to restrict movement. Travelers and shepherds often wore several layers, topped with a heavy woolen cloak that could also serve as a shelter. Townspeople of higher status could afford finer wool, as well as additional elements such as leather belts, fur linings, and better shoes. Despite all the difficulties and limitations, medieval clothing was a true work of engineering, adapted to the harsh realities of life. It was not just a shelter from the cold, but a complex system that allowed people to lead their normal lives, even in the most severe frosts. And although we are used to thinking of it as something uncomfortable and archaic, it was actually incredibly practical and functional. Write in the comments how you dress in winter to stay warm. The central element of the wardrobe was the tunic. It was not just a piece of fabric, but a versatile item worn by both men and women. It could be long or short, with or without sleeves, but its main function always remained the same: to create a basic warm layer. Tunics were made of wool, often coarse and undyed. This made them incredibly strong and durable, which was extremely important in conditions where clothes were not changed as often as they are today. Under long tunics, which reached the knees or even the ankles, pants called breeches were worn. They were baggy and tied at the waist, which allowed them to be worn over another layer, undergarments. This provided additional protection for the legs, which were most vulnerable to the cold. In colder weather, another, thicker tunic was worn over the tunic, and a cloak over that. This multi-layered cake allowed the body temperature to be regulated depending on activity and weather conditions. Depending on social status, tunics could vary in length and quality. Tunics worn by nobles were longer, often reaching the ankles, and were made of finer, dyed wool or even silk imported from distant countries. In contrast, the tunics of peasants and simple craftsmen were short, knee-length, so as not to interfere with work in the fields or in the workshop. They were coarse, often made of undyed wool, and were used for everyday work. Tunics had a simple cut. They were two rectangular pieces of fabric sewn together at the sides and shoulders, with an opening for the head and sleeves. Despite its simplicity, this cut was extremely effective. It allowed clothes to be sewn with minimal fabric waste, which was extremely important in conditions where every scrap was valuable. The seams were strong so that the tunic could withstand years of wear and washing. The edges were often trimmed to prevent the fabric from fraying. Sometimes tunics were belted, which not only gave them a neater appearance, but also had practical significance. The belt helped to keep the garment in place, prevented it from flapping in the wind, and helped to distribute heat evenly. A belted tunic also created a small pocket in which small items such as keys or a wallet could be carried. This was convenient, as pockets as we know them did not appear until much later. For extra warmth, tunics could be lined. This was another way to use layering. Linings were made of lighter wool or linen, which made the clothing more comfortable and less itchy. In fact, the use of linings was a sign of high craftsmanship and wealth. The tunic was a symbol of versatility and practicality. It was equally comfortable for hard work and for relaxing by the hearth. You could sit, stand, walk, and even sleep in it, and it always provided a basic level of protection from the cold. It was the foundation upon which other layers of clothing were layered: cloaks, capes, and headwear, which in turn provided additional protection. Thus, the tunic was not just clothing, but a well-designed foundation for survival in harsh winter conditions. Can you imagine that in the Middle Ages, people used modern layering so skillfully to control their comfort? We'll talk more about that later. The hood was an integral part of the medieval wardrobe. It was not just a decoration, but served many functions. First, it protected the head, neck, and ears from wind and cold. This was critically important, as most of the body's heat is lost through the head. Hoods were part of outer garments, such as cloaks or woolen jackets. They were made large enough to be pulled over the head and worn over headgear. However, the hood had another, more unexpected function. In the Middle Ages, unlike today, there was no widespread access to baths and hot water. Wearing a hood over the head helped maintain hair hygiene. It protected hair from dust and dirt, which were ubiquitous at the time. Thus, hoods not only helped keep people warm, but also helped maintain cleanliness in conditions far removed from those of today. Hoods often had a long, narrow tail called a liripip. This detail served not only decorative purposes, but was also practical. The liripip could be wrapped around the neck or face to protect against the wind, or even used to carry small items. Depending on social status and region, hoods could vary greatly. Peasants' and workers' hoods were simple and functional, often made of coarse wool of the same color as the rest of their clothing. They were thick enough to withstand harsh weather conditions and protect against wind and rain. For them, the hood was not just an item of clothing, but a necessity that allowed them to work outdoors even in the coldest weather. In contrast, the hoods of the nobility and wealthy townspeople were more elaborate. They were made of fine wool or even velvet, decorated with embroidery, and often lined with fur or silk. The shape of the hood could also indicate status. Wealthy people could afford hoods with long, elegant lyrical flaps that could be tied into fancy knots. These knots had no practical purpose, but served as a symbol of wealth and fashion. In some cases, the hood was not a separate piece of clothing, but an integrated element of a cloak or tunic. This made it even more convenient, as it could not be lost. In addition, this design prevented gaps between the clothing and the hood, providing better protection from the cold. The hood could also be part of special clothing, such as monastic robes. where it had symbolic meaning. The design of the hood itself was equally important. It could be sewn as a single piece with the cloak or be a separate accessory worn on the head. This versatility allowed people to choose their clothing according to the weather and their activities. In addition, in some regions, hoods could be lined with fur or cotton wool, which made them even warmer and more comfortable. This was especially important for travelers who had to spend the night in the cold. Thus, the hood was a multifunctional item that combined practicality, fashion, and social status. It was not just an element of clothing, but a well-thought-out tool that allowed people to survive in harsh conditions, maintain hygiene, and express their belonging to a certain social class. Protecting the feet was just as important as protecting the body. Footwear in the Middle Ages was pretty simple: leather boots or shoes. But even here, there were some tricks. Shoes were made of thick leather, sometimes even several layers to provide better insulation. The soles were stiff, which not only helped with walking, but also protected against the cold coming from the ground. Warm woolen socks or leg wraps were often worn inside the shoes. This created an extra layer that retained heat. In conditions of constant movement, when the feet are the first to get cold, this was vital. The shoes were not waterproof in the modern sense, so in wet weather, wooden insoles or soles were often used, which were worn over the leather shoes. These were called pattens and helped to raise the foot above the mud and slush, keeping the shoes drier. Shoe styles also depended on social status and place of residence. Peasant shoes were practical and functional. They were simple shoes or boots made of thick, coarse leather. They were designed for hard work and had to withstand constant contact with dirt and stones. They had flat soles that provided stability on uneven ground. The shoes of wealthy people, on the other hand, were more refined. They could be thinner, made of softer leather, and decorated with embroidery or appliques. Wealthy townspeople and the nobility wore boots with pointed, elongated toes called pouleni. The longer and sharper the toe, the higher the status of the owner. Sometimes these toes were so long that they had to be tied to the shin so as not to interfere with walking. This was a clear sign that the owner did not engage in physical labor. In addition, shoes were often dyed bright colors such as red, green, or blue using natural dyes. This was an expensive luxury available only to wealthy people. Thus, the color of shoes, like clothing in general, served to demonstrate wealth and social status. Shoes could also be decorated with metal buckles, which were another sign of status. Thus, shoes were not just protection from the cold, but an important element that reflected social status and occupation. They were part of a sophisticated system that allowed people to survive and thrive in conditions far removed from modern comforts. Shoemaking in the Middle Ages was a separate craft, and master shoemakers, or cordwainers, were highly valued. But what else besides the material and layers was important in medieval footwear? Maybe we have more in common than you think, and people back then cared about color and the style just as much as we do today. We'll find out soon. Stay tuned.
Blessings unto you all.
The color of clothing in the Middle Ages was an indicator of social status. Rich people could afford bright, rich dyes, while the poor wore clothes in natural, earthy shades. But color also played a practical role, especially in winter. Dark colors such as black, brown, or dark blue absorbed sunlight better and therefore kept you warmer. In conditions of short daylight hours and low sun, this was an important advantage. Clothes for outdoor work, for example, for peasants or workers, were usually uncolored or dark. This made them more practical, as stains and dirt were less noticeable on such fabric. In addition, natural colors were cheaper, which allowed for the sewing of thicker and warmer clothes. Lighter colors, such as white or gray, were less common because they did not absorb heat as well. They were mainly used for underwear, which did not need to be very warm, or for decorative elements on the clothing of the nobility. The production of dyes was a complex and expensive process. The most common dyes were obtained from plants. For example, shades of red were obtained from madder root, blue from woad leaves, and brown and yellow from tree bark. These dyes were relatively affordable, but required a lot of time and effort to collect and process the raw materials. A large amount of material and special skills were required to obtain rich and lasting colors. The most expensive and rare colors, such as purple, were available only to the wealthiest members of society. Purple dye was obtained from rare sea mollusks, and its production was so labor-intensive that the cost of 1 pound of purple wool could be equal to the cost of an entire house. Therefore, purple became a symbol of royal power and high status. Social norms at the time strictly regulated who could wear which colors. There were so-called luxury laws that prohibited commoners from wearing certain fabrics and colors. This was done to clearly define and maintain the hierarchy of society. For example, peasants were forbidden to wear purple or scarlet, as these colors were reserved for the nobility. However, even ordinary people had ways to add individuality to their clothes. They could use cheaper, more accessible dyes to create stripes or patterns. For example, the combination of blue and yellow, obtained from woad and madder, was quite popular. This allowed them to add a little variety to their monochrome wardrobe without breaking strict social rules. Thus, the color of clothing in the Middle Ages was not just an aesthetic choice. It reflected social status, economic opportunities, and even practical needs. Clothing was not just a shelter from the cold, but a kind of calling card that allowed you to instantly determine who was in front of you. The profession of dyer or distin was one of the most important in medieval society. It was a difficult and dangerous craft that required a deep knowledge of chemistry and a great deal of patience. Dyers worked with huge vats filled with boiling solutions and inhaled fumes from dyes that could be poisonous. They had to know how to prepare the fabric properly so that it would absorb the dye well, and also how to fix the color so that it would not wash out or fade in the sun. To fix the color, dyers used mordants, substances that helped the dye absorb better into the fibers. Mordants included alum, salt, oak bark, and even urine, which contained ammonia. This process was critically important, as without mordants, the color would quickly fade. The profession of dyer was so important that they had their own guilds and workshops, which controlled the quality of products and passed on the secrets of their craft from generation to generation. The quality and fastness of the color also depended on the type of fabric. Wool, thanks to its structure, absorbed dyes better and retained color longer than linen. Therefore, woolen clothing was not only warmer, but also looked brighter and more presentable. The use of color and dyes in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of fashion. It was a sign of skill, wealth, and social order, and each thread dyed a certain shade had a deep meaning. The cloak was one of the most important items in the winter wardrobe. It was not just an outer layer, but a versatile tool for survival. Cloaks were made of thick, heavy wool, which provided maximum protection from the wind and cold. They were large and spacious so that they could be thrown over other clothes. A cloak could be used for more than just clothing. If necessary, it could be turned into a blanket or a bedding for sleeping, which was very useful for travelers and shepherds. Sometimes cloaks were made with hoods, which made them even more versatile. Cloaks were fastened on the shoulder with a fibula or clasp. This allowed the hands to remain free, which was important for work. Some cloaks were so long that their ends could be wrapped around the body to create an extra layer of warmth. There were several types of cloaks, differing in shape, size, and purpose. One of the most common was the cape, which was simply thrown over the shoulders and fastened at the chest. It was simple to make and very effective. Another type was a cloak with sleeves, which resembled a modern coat but was much looser in cut. It provided greater protection from the wind, but was less versatile as it could not be used as easily as a blanket. The quality of a cloak depended directly on the status of its owner. Peasants' cloaks were coarse, dark, and often made of undyed wool. They were durable but not particularly attractive. The cloaks of the nobility, on the other hand, could be true works of art. They were made of fine, high-quality wool, dyed in bright colors, and often lined with fur. The fur not only added warmth, but was also a symbol of wealth and power. Sable, ermine, or fox fur was incredibly expensive and was used only by the highest nobility. In addition, the cloak could serve other purposes. It could be used to hide things, carry food, or even as a temporary shelter during travel. For travelers, it was one of the most valuable items, as it provided protection in all conditions. It was so important that it is mentioned in many chronicles and literary works of the time. The cloak was not just an item of clothing, but part of everyday life. It served as a kind of mobile home for those who spent a lot of time outdoors. Shepherds, for example, could use it to protect themselves from rain and wind, shelter under it at night, and during the day it allowed them to move freely and do their work. In cities, the cloak was part of the urban landscape. It was convenient for merchants who spent all day at the market and for craftsmen whose workshops were open to the elements. For women, the cloak was no less important. Women's cloaks were longer and more elegant than men's. They were often decorated with embroidery and had a more complex cut. Women used them to protect themselves from the cold when they left the house and to cover the dresses they wore inside. The symbolic meaning of the cloak was also enormous. It was a symbol of honor, and in many cultures, it was given as a sign of respect. At the same time, it could be taken away as a punishment or as a sign of humiliation. The cloak was an integral part of a knight's attire and part of the official costume of the nobility. Its appearance, color, fabric quality, and the presence of fur said more about a person than words could. Thus, the cloak was not just an item of clothing, but a key tool for survival that combined practicality, versatility, and, for the nobility, status. It was indispensable in harsh winters and allowed people to stay warm and safe. What other item in the wardrobe, besides the cloak, was just as multifunctional? We'll find out very soon. Hands, like feet, were very vulnerable to the cold. But mittens and gloves were luxury items that were not available to everyone. The poor often did without them, simply hiding their hands in their sleeves. However, for those who could afford them, mittens were essential. They were made of thick wool, often sewn together from several layers. Unlike modern gloves, medieval mittens had a simple design: a separate compartment for the thumb and one large compartment for the rest of the fingers. This allowed the hands to stay together, which helped to keep them warm. Gloves with separate fingers were more complicated to make and were worn mainly by knights who needed to hold weapons or wealthy merchants who were involved in writing. For ordinary people who could not afford mittens, there were other ways to protect their hands. For example, they could use the wide, long sleeves of their tunics and cloaks to hide their hands. This was not as effective as mittens, but it still provided some protection from the wind and cold. Also, in winter, people tried to work with tools that did not require constant contact with cold surfaces to minimize the risk of frostbite. For those who could afford mittens, they were not just protection, but an important accessory. Mittens, sewn from thick wool, often had leather palms for better grip and protection from wear. They could be decorated with embroidery that reflected the status of the owner. For example, the mittens of the nobility could be embroidered with coats of arms or other symbols. Gloves with separate fingers, or gauntlets, were part of a knight's armor. They were made of leather and metal to protect the hands during combat. But even civilians of high status could afford leather gloves, which served to protect the hands while riding or hunting. These gloves were thinner than gauntlets and were often decorated. Overall, gloves and mittens were a striking example of how social status influenced clothing. The absence of this item in a commoner's wardrobe meant that their work did not require such protection, or that they could not afford it. Conversely, the presence of gloves was a sign of wealth and social standing. In addition to their obvious function of protecting against the cold, gloves and mittens had other practical uses. For example, gloves made of thick leather were used to handle hot objects. Blacksmiths, glass blowers, and other craftsmen who worked with fire needed protection, and leather gloves were the ideal solution. In turn, gloves, used for falconry, were a special type of protective gear. They were made of thick leather to protect the hand from the bird's sharp talons. These gloves were often decorated and were a symbol of high status, as falconry was a favorite pastime of the nobility. In everyday life, gloves were also used to maintain cleanliness. People ate with their hands and gloves helped keep them clean. Wealthy people could afford to have several pairs of gloves, which they changed depending on the situation, for work, for celebrations, or for protection from the cold. In some cases, gloves were part of formal attire. They were worn by priests during religious ceremonies, as well as by judges and other representatives of authority. Such gloves were often made of white leather and had no particular practical significance. but were a symbol of purity and authority. Thus, gloves and mittens in the Middle Ages were not just protection from the cold, but a complex social and functional element. They reflected status, occupation, and even cultural traditions. Their presence or absence in a person's wardrobe could tell us much more about them than we can imagine today. Headwear was an important part of the medieval wardrobe, especially in winter. It not only protected against the cold, but also served as an indicator of status. Commoners wore simple woolen caps or wraps. They were practical and functional, protecting the head and ears from the wind. Wealthy people wore more elaborate headwear, decorated and made from expensive materials. For example, the chaperon was popular, a hood with a long tail that could be wrapped around the head. Women wore scarves or wraps that covered the head and neck. For men, especially peasants and craftsmen, the most common headwear was a simple woolen cap, often round or conical in shape. Sometimes it was just a band that was wrapped around the head and tied at the back. Such headwear was inexpensive and easy to make, making it accessible to everyone. It protected the head from wind and cold, which was critical when working outdoors. Felt hats were especially popular because they were denser and more waterproof than regular wool. The wealthy and well-known townspeople could afford more sophisticated headwear. In addition to the aforementioned chaperon, men wore berets, wide-brimmed felt hats, and even turbans, which were a symbol of exoticism and wealth. These headdresses were made of fine fabrics such as velvet and silk, and decorated with feathers, precious stones, or embroidery. Their shape and size often depended on fashion trends, which spread quickly among the nobility. Women's headwear was even more diverse and had strict rules for wearing. Unmarried girls could walk with their heads uncovered or wear simple headbands. Married women, on the other hand, had to cover their heads. In the Middle Ages, hair was considered a symbol of female beauty and had to be hidden from prying eyes. Therefore, women wore scarves, hoods, or veils. These headdresses protected not only from the cold, but also from dust and dirt. In winter, women wore thicker headwear. These could be hoods made of wool or more complex designs consisting of several layers of fabric. Sometimes they used fur linings to provide extra warmth. Veils worn by wealthy women could be made of thin linen or silk, but in cold weather, they were replaced with thicker materials. Headwear also had symbolic meaning. For example, crowns and tiaras were symbols of royal power. Hats with long feathers could indicate membership of the knightly class, while simple scarves indicated membership of the peasant class. Thus, headwear was not just an item of clothing, but an important tool for social identification. In the end, headwear in medieval England wasn't just functional, but also a complex part of culture. It kept people warm, showed social status, and helped express individuality as much as possible under strict social rules. Despite the absence of modern underwear, the Middle Ages had its own system of undergarments. People wore undershirts or tunics, often made of linen. These served as the first layer, which absorbed moisture. Clothing made of warmer materials was worn over them to help retain heat. This multi-layered system, starting with underwear, was a key element in protecting against the cold. It prevented hypothermia, which could occur if sweat remained on the skin. Although this underwear was not as comfortable as modern underwear, it was an effective tool for survival. The main element of men's underwear was the breech, or simply breech, as we mentioned earlier. These were loose linen trousers that were tied at the waist. They provided a basic layer of protection and comfort, and, most importantly, they were easy to wash. Linen was the ideal material for underwear, as it absorbed moisture well and dried quickly. This was critical in conditions where clothes were not changed daily, and washing was a laborious process. Women's underwear was more complex and consisted of a shirt or camisa, a long linen shirt that reached down to the ankles. It was worn under outer clothing and served the same purpose. It absorbed moisture and protected against the rough wool of the outer layers. Camisoles were made of thin but durable linen and were quite loose so as not to restrict movement. In addition to linen, other materials could also be used for underwear. For example, in colder regions or for people engaged in heavy outdoor work, woolen undershirts could be used. They were warmer but could cause discomfort as the wool was prickly. In such cases, to avoid irritation, another linen shirt was worn under the woolen shirt. The importance of underwear was not only in keeping warm, It also helped maintain hygiene. Underwear could be washed more often, which helped keep the body clean and protect outer clothing from dirt. This was especially important in conditions where washing outer clothing was difficult. The washing process in the Middle Ages was far from modern. Clothes were washed in rivers or streams using lye, a mixture of ash and water, as a detergent. They were then beaten on stones and dried in the wind. This process was labor-intensive and not always effective, so underwear that could be easily washed played a huge role in everyday life. Ultimately, the underwear system was an invisible but critically important element of the medieval wardrobe. It was the basis of multi-layered protection against the cold, allowed for hygiene, and made people's lives more comfortable in conditions that seem unbearably harsh to us today. It was a thoughtful and effective approach that proved its viability over hundreds of years. So, we have seen that medieval winter clothing was much more sophisticated than we might have imagined. It was based on a few key principles: layering, the use of natural materials such as wool and linen, and versatility. Coats, tunics, hoods, and even mittens were not just items of clothing. They were tools for survival. Every detail of clothing had a purpose. Wool retained heat and repelled moisture. Linen wicks away sweat. Cloaks served not only as clothing, but also as blankets, and hoods protected the head and neck from the wind. It was not just fashion, but an engineering solution that allowed people to lead active lives even in the harshest frost. Ultimately, the secret to survival in the English Middle Ages was not in any one element, but in their thoughtful combination. The layering system was the cornerstone of the medieval wardrobe. It was an intuitive understanding of how insulation works. The first layer, linen underwear, served to wick away moisture. If sweat remained on the skin, it evaporated, cooling the body. Linen, by absorbing moisture, allowed the skin to remain dry, which was critical for preventing hypothermia. The second layer, a woolen tunic, created an air pocket that trapped the heat emitted by the body. Wool, with its natural structure, was the ideal material for this. It trapped air in its fibers, acting as a natural insulator. Finally, the top layer, a cloak, served as protection from external factors such as wind, rain, and snow. In this way, each layer performed its unique function, working together with the others to provide maximum comfort and protection. The second key principle was versatility. Medieval clothing was not highly specialized. The same tunic could be worn for work in the fields during the day and for relaxing by the hearth in the evening. A cloak could be used as clothing, a blanket, or a mattress. This was due not only to a lack of choice, but also to practical necessity. Clothing was expensive and had to be used as efficiently as possible. Therefore, each item of clothing was designed to serve several functions at once. This versatility allowed people to survive in conditions where they could not afford to have a separate outfit for every occasion. The third principle was the use of natural materials. Wool and linen were readily available, and most importantly, had unique properties. Wool repelled water and retained heat even when wet, while linen was durable and absorbed moisture well. These materials not only provided protection, but were also environmentally friendly, as they could be produced locally. In addition, they were durable and could withstand harsh conditions. Leather also played an important role, especially in footwear and accessories. It was strong and provided protection against impact and wear. All this, combined with a well-thought-out cut, made medieval clothing a true marvel of engineering. The cut was simple to minimize fabric waste while allowing freedom of movement. Wide sleeves and loose-fitting tunics allowed for additional layers to be worn underneath. Hoods were spacious enough to be pulled over the head over other headwear. Everything was thought out down to the smallest detail. Ultimately, winter clothing in the English Middle Ages was not just fashion or style. It was a complex system developed and refined over many centuries to help people survive in harsh conditions. It was a combination of knowledge about materials, practical experience, and an understanding of human needs. It was engineering thought embodied in fabric and leather that allowed people to live, work, and thrive even in the coldest weather. We have learned how clothing, which seems simple at first glance, became a complex system that helped people survive in harsh conditions. This layered approach and use of natural materials shows how inventive people were at that time. Despite the lack of modern technology, medieval English people intuitively developed principles that we still use today. Layering, thermoregulation, and the use of water-repellent and moisture-wicking fabrics were all part of their everyday lives. Every item of clothing, from linen shirts to heavy wool cloaks, was not just clothing, but a well-thought-out tool for survival. This system allowed them to work in the fields, travel, and live a full life without fear of the cold. How do you think you would cope with such a winter wearing only medieval clothing? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new videos. See you soon.